to this next story here. If you did not know, Danny Haiphong actually just addressed the UN Security Council in reference to NATO's Ukraine aid. So, we've talked a lot in reference to the billions of dollars that's gone out the door to Ukraine, the Pentagon failing audits, and there seems to just be no accountability here. Like, money is just flying out the window, and it seems like our government doesn't have to explain where it's going because it's going to the military industrial complex. But you notice they have to explain where it's going when it's going to any type of social programs or something to help the people. Considering the fact that Joe Biden announced that he was giving $700 per household to people in Hawaii, it's really a slap in the face when you see billions of dollars go out the door to Ukraine, but we only want to give people $700 per household to one of our own states. So Danny did the damn thing. Let's give Danny a shout out over here. If you haven't seen this, you're going to see this now. I'll have to reach out to Danny probably later on, probably not now because he's probably exhausted from this trip. But I'll reach out to Danny later on to have him come on and talk about how this whole process went, because we've had people do this a number of times before. They present to the UN, but I never really understood the process, like what happens after this, So let's go ahead and get into it. I now give the floor
to Mr. Danny Haiphong.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the council, Mr. President. Today I'm here as a journalist who has dedicated the last 10 years of my life writing about and speaking out against the long record of human rights abuses and war crimes committed by my country of birth, the United States. I don't consider this a hobby or even a profession, but rather a duty to all of humanity and those who want to see a better and more peaceful future. I am here too as a U.S. citizen who has witnessed tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars go to funding and arming a proxy war against Russia, while people in the U.S., ordinary people, suffer from rising levels of poverty, homelessness, suicide, and economic insecurity. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1958, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. On June 2nd, 2023, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave a speech in Helsinki where he stated that military support for Ukraine must be prioritized over diplomacy. The argument goes that a steady supply of arms to Ukraine will turn the tide on the battlefield and force Russia to the negotiating table.
And we see that has not happened. All of the money that's been sent to Ukraine, all the weapons, all the packages that they have sent to Ukraine, you see that has not turned the table in reference to the war with Russia. They're not at the negotiating table. When they did have the opportunity to negotiate earlier on. Of course, the United States didn't want that. NATO didn't want that. And we've just seen this war continue to escalate. Ukraine is losing. So all of the billions of dollars and the weapons that we've given to Ukraine, it's not helping them win this war, which experts predicted they would not be able to win at the very beginning in the first place. So what's all the money for?
Blinken is supposed to be the U.S.'s top diplomat, not a champion of escalating conflict. However, the sentiment that he communicated has been a foundational feature of the justifications given for the West's continued flow of arms to Ukraine. The facts, however, undermine Blinken's assertions. First, U.S. and Western arms are anathema to resolving conflict. The U.S. is the biggest arms exporter in the world, comprising around 40% of all global arms sales. These arms have been instrumental in the bloodiest wars of our last 2 generations, including the U.S.-led invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. U.S. arms play a major role in escalating tensions in the Korean Peninsula and the military encirclement of Russia and China, which has ushered in a new Cold War and all of the risks that come with it. Second, it was never Russia that needed to be forced to the negotiating table. Back in December 2021, if we remember, Russia provided draft proposals of security guarantees to the U.S. and to NATO that were meant to serve as the basis of dialogue and negotiation.
And that's the message. That's actually the narrative that mainstream media continues to repeat. They make it seem like Russia never wanted to negotiate. They make it seem like, you know, Vladimir Putin's, though he has his faults as well, but they make it seem like Vladimir Putin has not tried to be reasonable in any way, shape, or form, not once through this entire process. And that's not true. So when they say, like, if you watch mainstream media, the way they explain it, they make it seem like Russia is being unreasonable and is not willing to come to the negotiating table when they were actually willing to do that at the very beginning.
They were summarily rejected. By late January 2022, the U.S. announced 200,000 pounds of what was deemed quote unquote lethal aid to Ukraine in an obvious signal of escalation. In April 2022, both U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin traveled to Ukraine just weeks after a peace deal fell through and admitted that the U.S. was all in on winning the current fight in Ukraine. What they meant by this was that the U.S. was fully committed to corralling its own military arsenal and that of its NATO partners in a proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian. The absence of diplomacy in times of conflict cannot but lead to escalation. That Russia's security, and for that matter, the security of the entire world, has been dismissed so summarily by the West is proof enough that the ceaseless supply of arms to Ukraine endangers peace. Weapons to Ukraine do not represent some kind of quote-unquote arsenal of democracy, as some in the U.S. foreign policy establishment tout. NATO countries have already provided $40 billion in weapons to Ukraine over the span of this conflict, and we have witnessed these weapons become heavier, deadlier, and more provocative.
This is another interesting thing that Danny also points out here that I think sometimes people may not really think about. It's not just obviously the U.S. that's been giving them weapons and aid. It was also our allies, like Germany sent in Leopard tanks. France gave them aid. I'm trying to think of who else. All the NATO allies like gave them aid. We saw a lot of things happen monetarily that actually shows that those other countries were trying to help them too. So when I talk about the money, one thing to keep in mind, I've mainly just been talking about what we've sent. I've mainly just talked about the billions of dollars that have come from the United States. And that one time I covered about Germany sending in the Leopard tanks, but just consider the fact that a lot has come their way and they're still losing.
Stymieing the possibility of a negotiated settlement to this conflict. Many of these weapons have landed on the black market to drug cartels, criminal organizations, and indeed neo-Nazi and fascist elements, many of which now make up parts of Ukraine's armed forces.
And in countries in Africa too, because somehow some of those weapons ended up in countries in Africa.
Furthermore, NATO has essentially armed Ukrainian army after Ukrainian army at the expense of its own arsenal. The New York Times sounded the alarm 8 months ago that Ukraine is now the location of an artillery and tank war, the likes of which the West would.
This guy, we'll come back to Danny. This guy right here, he was cracking me up for a little bit because I'm like, what is he doing? Where'd it go? That guy was like on his phone. What happened to that guy? Okay, I guess the guy is gone now. I'm sorry.
Many of these weapons have landed on the black market to drug cartels, criminal organizations, and indeed neo-Nazi and fascist elements, many of which now make up parts of Ukraine's armed forces. Furthermore, NATO has essentially armed Ukrainian army after Ukrainian army at the expense of its own arsenal. The New York Times sounded the alarm 8 months ago that Ukraine is now the location of an artillery and.
This guy right here. What's he doing? Who you got to call? Whose call you got to take? I don't know.
Tank war, the likes of which the West was not prepared to fight long term. And if this is the case, then rational minds may assume that the West would cease its supply of deadly weaponry. But the opposite has occurred. The U.S. approved of sending cluster munitions to Ukraine last month, the same munitions that continue to kill and explode on civilians in Laos decades after the US invasion there, and which have long been condemned by over 100 countries worldwide.
Yep.
I'm a journalist and a geopolitical analyst, not a military expert. But such experts in recent months have come clean about the limitations of Western firepower. Camille Grand, former Assistant Secretary General of Defense Investment at NATO, stated that, quote, "a day in Ukraine is a month or more in Afghanistan," end quote. She is referencing the fact that Ukraine burns through nearly half of the artillery produced in the United States in a single day.
And we were in Afghanistan for over 20 years. So that's just something to think about, guys.
Per month in a single day. Former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, James Stavridis, acknowledged last May that analysts were correct to assume that Ukraine is burning through a year's worth of U.S. production monthly. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and U.S. President Joe Biden have both acknowledged these weapons shortages, with Biden admitting during his announcement of cluster munitions for Ukraine that, quote, "this is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of ammunition, and we're low on it," end quote. And I'm not even touching on issues of personnel, training, and other logistical items here.
What happens when they run out of weapons, you guys? Because this is something I've been wondering too. There's a shortage of some of these weapons that the US government has been sending to Ukraine. What happens when they run out of these weapons? I mean, it's just the way that they're burning through these weapons per day. They're just burning through it. And it's just, okay, we're done. Let's go back to the United States to give us more money and give us more aid.
All of these problems have come to a head as the last several months saw Ukraine's spring counteroffensive gain much discussion. For months, political and military officials in the West regularly broadcasted to media outlets of an oncoming, victorious offensive that would take large amounts of territory from Russia. Yet at the same time, Ukraine, and in particular its head of state, Volodymyr Zelensky, repeatedly demanded that the West increase its supply of heavy weaponry, including air power. Zelensky has blamed over and over the West for its lackluster supply of arms in conjunction with the months-long delay of this counteroffensive against Russia. Now, this counteroffensive is in its third month, and the results have been disastrous. Around 30% of NATO's weapon supplies to Ukraine have been destroyed. The death toll on the battlefield is staggering. An estimated 43,000 Ukrainian forces have been killed.
That's crazy, right? Remember what they said at the World Economic Forum? There was a statement there that said we plan to continue this until the last Ukrainian. These people are dying. They know it's like to go into this war that they knew they really could not. You know, like, how are you going to beat Russia? And if it ever got to the point where Russia felt like, okay, this is getting to be too much, they can always just knock on China's door and say, come help us out. The United States government, and I also feel like NATO, they basically sent these people, they sent these soldiers to their death. Usually I would say, well, you got this percentage of a chance. But with this situation, I feel like, no, they don't have a chance.
And reports are surfacing that local morgues in Ukraine are seeing nearly double the bodies since the counteroffensive began. And for what? The optimism of Western officials and diplomats has waned, with many now acknowledging that Ukraine has not even penetrated Russia's first defensive line. So I think the better question then is cui bono? Who benefits and what benefits from Western arms being poured into Ukraine? Certainly not Ukraine if the results of the counteroffensive and the conflict as a whole are the measure. And it certainly isn't global peace instability either. For all the benefits that come from an emerging multipolar world, the incessant militarization of Ukraine pushed by the West is helping fuel a worldwide economic slowdown and the potential of major power conflict, which could very well take on a nuclear character. So a simple answer to this question is the arms industry, the corporations that have profited mightily from this conflict. Shareholders of the largest military contractors are being paid handsomely since the conflict began as profits soar. The top 25 Western military contractors have seen their revenues increase by 11% over the past year to $212 billion. Arms sales are expected to increase to $450 billion in total by the end of 2023, an increase of $47 billion thanks to the Ukraine conflict.
Just think about what we could do with all of that money. $44 billion, $24 billion. Like, we could feed people in this country. But no, it's more profitable for our government to push war. We could end homelessness. Like, if we took some of that money from the military, from the defense budget, there's over $800 billion in the defense budget. Okay. If we took some of that money, we could try to end homelessness in this country. We could feed every kid at every school in this country. But no, war.
This bonanza in arms sales is thus making the slim minority of the richest people richer, while the rest of the world is left to resolve the myriad of problems left in the wake of this conflict. One of the primary responsibilities of the United Nations Security Council, as stated by the UN Charter, is the maintenance of international peace and stability. Ongoing Western arms sales to Ukraine are not only a violation of the UN Charter, but they also reveal the geopolitical realities that undergird this conflict. Indeed, it would be simplistic to claim that profits alone from Western arms sales are what is driving a wedge in the cause of peace. The United States, where I reside, has a long record of waging unilateral military conflict on a global scale in contravention of the UN Charter, with 800 plus foreign military bases, 11 command structures, and a public military budget of nearly $1 trillion US. There is now an open conflict within the US foreign policy establishment over whether Ukraine and arming Ukraine to maximum effect is a good idea, or whether other military matters deserve more attention, with a leaked memo from top Air Force brass claiming that the US must prepare to go to war with China by 2025. So Ukraine thus finds itself in the eye of a much larger storm, that of a US policy of great power competition, or what is better termed great power confrontation, led by the United States. Peace and stability is not possible so long as the West pursues a foreign policy of unilateral interventionism in Ukraine to fulfill a larger goal, a larger geopolitical goal of unipolarity.
You know what's really sad is that I'm just thinking about all the people in Ukraine that really believe the US is helping them, and that really believe that their country is going to be better after all this is over. Economically, their country is going to be ruined. You don't have to look at too many other examples just to prove that, but economically, this is going to be done. And then what's going to happen to those people then? That's the thing, is like, I feel like the US is really good at selling a story, dropping off the bomb, running away, and when the bomb explodes, the US is nowhere to be found. Because that's what's going to happen. Think about the economy in Ukraine. When all this is over, what's going to happen to the economy in Ukraine? What's going to happen if they start to run out of soldiers?
This policy runs completely counter to the principles of the UN Charter. The continued flow of arms to Ukraine is a violation of Article 2, Section 3 of this charter, requiring member states to resolve conflict in a peaceful manner. And these arms only prolong the conflict with devastating consequences. Yep. The US and its Western partners, and whoever goes along with it, must learn to operate within the framework of international law, just like all other member states, or the world will face the continued threat of instability and war, no matter the efforts of this Security Council and other United Nations bodies Thank you so much for your time.
So kudos to Danny. This is on his channel. If you're not following Danny, I think most of you probably already are, but if you're not following Danny, you should. Danny Haiphong's his channel, and it's called Danny Haiphong Addresses UN Security Council on NATO's Ukraine aid. So definitely check out Danny's channel. He focuses primarily on geopolitics. So if you want to hear like more news about foreign policy, more international news in general, like you should check out his channel because he talks a lot about that. But I have to say this, and I want to be very clear here. Like, it boggles my mind how so many people would not even question the intentions of NATO and the US government, particularly those of us that remember the war in Iraq. And I don't care. Like, you don't come away from that after they sold us a lie in reference to the war in Iraq when they told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction. So they lied to us about the war in Iraq. And a lot of us got it wrong. And that included myself. But I learned something from that. And I said, well, damn, they lied to us. What else have they lied to us about? So going forward with me, it's like with all these other conflicts, I am always skeptical because it's just the amount of a people who have been so easily convinced that Russia is this boogeyman and China is this boogeyman. How many of those people actually took a step back and thought about the economic reasons in reference to this war? Have thought about the fact that China has the top largest banks in the world. If you look at the top 10, China has most of them. The fact that China actually has done a pretty good job, they're not perfect, but a pretty good job of trying to eradicate homelessness in China. And I only know these things because a lot of my students were from China. So they explained a lot of these things to me. So it was like gone were the days of people coming from China to study in the United States and trying to get the visa to stay in the United States. Most of my students had no intention of staying here. Most of my students wanted to go back home because they said they knew they would be guaranteed a job and they were guaranteed housing. And so I guess I just don't understand why more Americans are not willing to question any type of war that the US government and particularly mainstream media convince you is the right thing to do after everything that we saw with the war in Iraq. And even after like Afghanistan, like I don't understand. I don't get it. I don't understand how people won't question it. Like, why would you trust these people after they lied to us? And it's not even a little lie, It wasn't like Saddam Hussein has like someone held hostage that could potentially be a US soldier. It wasn't even something like that, It was weapons of mass destruction. Like they had to go big and extreme with it. So for me, I just don't understand how people are so convinced in this country to believe everything the US government tells you. I just told you guys earlier today about the congressmen and the senators and Rudy Giuliani about how they went to bat for big pharma and they protected the Sackler family and allowed them to continue poisoning the American people for another freaking decade. So why would you trust these people? Everything that happens in DC revolves around money. No money, no congressmen, no senators. Something to think about. I'm going to go to some of the comments in the chat. Dave says Ukraine is winning on corporate media. LOL. I know, right? Like CNN actually finally admitted that they weren't because they just couldn't hide that anymore. Anna says Ukraine is a big windfall for Lockheed, Raytheon, etc., and DC by extension. Thank you, Benji. Great work, Sabrina. Thank you. Cheers from Switzerland. Well, cheers. Thank you, Dogs, for the win. So Russian occupied Ukraine is going to be a prosperous, peaceful country? I don't know. Dogs for the win. And Kali says if they tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it over and over, it becomes truth. This is true. This is true. They just keep they have to be repetitive.